But I think to start off the discussion about cholesterol and our fear of it and our belief that it predicts heart disease and that if we could only lower it, we would be protected, we need to start right with the way we measure cholesterol. Because people often misunderstand us when we say cholesterol is not important or you don't need to be looking at your high versus low cholesterol. We don't think that there's nothing that cholesterol has to tell us. We think we're measuring it by a technology that's 70 years old and that's incorrect. And what we say is that don't even talk to us about high cholesterol till we know how you're measuring it, because if you're using an outdated and inaccurate way of measuring it, then we have nothing to talk about yet. Your high cholesterol might be masking a perfectly healthy heart profile, and your low cholesterol might be masking a risky one. And that was the case with me, which I'll tell you in just a minute. So the way I try to explain this to people, I live in California, we have very, very strict smog regulations, and we always have to have our cars tested for emissions. So there are these smog testing places, and you have to take your car to one, and then they give you a bill of health, or they give you a non-bill of health, and they say, Mr. Jones, you got to fix this. It's going to cost $1,700. Take it over there. That's what you got to do. And everybody does it because we want to comply with the emissions and because there's no way to get a license if you don't. Well, what if you found out that the device that the garage is using hasn't been calibrated since 1963, that the algorithm doesn't even include the toxins that have been invented in the last 10 years because they weren't invented at the time the machine was first set up, and then it's giving wildly inaccurate readings. So some people might come away with their car saying, God, I got to put $1,800 into fixing this. And it turns out that nothing bad's coming out of the exhaust. Whereas other people are driving around thinking, I'm just doing fine. And they're a toxic waste dump because the machine's not catching it. So before we go any further talking about cholesterol, we have to talk about the fact that the machine that's measuring it is broken. And I can tell you how that happened. You know, you're probably too young to remember this. Most people that I tell this to don't remember it. But in the 60s, we had health fairs. And you would go to a health fair to kind of be educated about what was important about health. And there'd be somebody at the booth with a white lab coat. And they'd do a little fingerprint and a little finger prick. Yeah. And they'd say, Mrs. Jones, let's check your cholesterol. Oh, it's 240. Very good. Because at that time, actually, 240 was the amount that was okay. They keep dumbing it down so they get more patients, but they'd give you one number, and that was your number. Your cholesterol is 220, it's 190, this is good, this is bad. And around 1963-ish, the technology became more common where they could actually look a little more closely and say, you know what, cholesterol actually travels in containers. It doesn't travel in the bloodstream. It's hydrophobic. It won't last 1 second in the bloodstream. It's got to travel in containers. And it looks like they travel in two different kind of containers. One of them is an HDL, a high-density lipoprotein. The other one is an LDL, a low-density lipoprotein. But the L in both of those, HDL and LDL, stands for lipoprotein. That was the boat that carried the cargo of cholesterol. And now we had an improved way of measuring it because HDL and LDL, generally speaking, kind of did different things in the body. And scientists picked a way of describing them, unfortunately, very simplistic way that said HDL, we'll call that the good one, and we'll call LDL the bad one. But basically, there are two kinds of boats, and they're transporting the cargo of cholesterol. Well, that was great for 1963. And what I always say to audiences is the flip phone was great for 1989. You still want to use it when you have an iPhone 12? I mean, come on. So we now know, Dr. Gundry, that there are 13 different subcategories of cholesterol, not two. Not only that, we know they come in different sizes. And those sizes actually matter. Sometimes the size of a lipoprotein is like a big fluffy tennis ball. It doesn't really do much damage. Other times it's a nasty little atherogenic BB gun particle sized one. Those sizes matter. The pattern of distribution matters. And what matters the most is the number of lipoproteins. Because think about this. Just as a logical management task, if you've got to manage a crowd of millions of people, there's more likelihood of accidents. There's more likelihood of somebody has a gun. If you're managing a Marine and you want to make sure the boats are all safe, the more boats in the water, more likelihood somebody accidentally bumps up against another. If you're a bouncer and a bartender, the more crowded the bar, the more likelihood somebody spills a drink, somebody starts a fight. It's the same thing with the bloodstream. We need to be looking at how many lipoproteins are in the water. And this is the punchline. We have the tests to do all of that. We've got the iPhone 12s and the Galaxy 9s, but doctors are still using this test from 1963, and worse, they're prescribing drugs based upon this test, which is defective. So our first mission is to retire the HDL-LDL test forever and put it on the dustbin of out-of-date ideas where it has long belonged.
Well, so what's the replacement? You obviously have one, and I obviously have one, but I'm interviewing you.
It's the same replacement. We now have this technology. It's called nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, and there's an MR cholesterol test, and it looks under the hood. And I show people and readers when I'm doing this, with PowerPoint, I show them mine. And it's just there's different tests available to every major lab in the country. LabCorp and Quest, these are the ones your doctor uses. They all offer a version of this. Some of them call it the lipo panel, the advanced lipid profile, the NMR particle test. Doesn't matter. They all look at the same data, which is all the subtypes of cholesterol, the number of boats in the water, which predicts heart disease way better than the amount of cargo in the boat, and finally the pattern of distribution of whether they're big particles or little particles. This is valuable information. This matters. The HDL-LDL test does not.
So I'll give you an example. I do those in my office. That's what we order, and we use several labs to do it. But interestingly, I had a woman yesterday in my office who we go through all this, and she has very few small dense LDL particles. She doesn't oxidize her small dense particles. She doesn't oxidize her ApoB, and we're just kind of talking shop. But we get all done, and I say, you are at so low risk. And she said, how can you say that? Because my cardiologist showed me that my total cholesterol is 242, and I'm a walking time bomb, and I have to be on a statin drug. And this is true. This was yesterday.
I believe you. I'll match your horror story for horror. How about this? I have a very close friend, 69 years old. She doesn't have an ounce of body fat. As a human being, her risk factors for heart disease are probably around 0. Exercises every day. Joyous life. Great cook. Wonderful family. Low inflammatory measures. Everything is perfect. Low blood sugar. It's all perfect, right? She's got a 300-something cholesterol. Her doctor's, you're on a statin or I'm firing you as a patient. Now, we've gone through this for years, and I've said, get the real test and then we'll talk. Wouldn't do it. Nope, we don't need it. So finally, when it was like she was either going to change doctors or he was going to fire her, he says, I'll tell you what, we'll do a compromise. We'll do a calcium coronary scan. And for anybody, I'm sure your audience knows what that is. It's a picture. We're not going to guess because of the cholesterol. We're going to look inside the arteries and see if there's any plaque. And the scores go from 0 to like 1,000, and there's a whole algorithm. And so she's 69. She goes in. She says this, and they say this will be the final arbiter. Fair enough? They take the picture. Her calcium coronary scan is 0. 0. I would die to have that number. She goes back to the doctor. You know what he says? I want to put you on a statin just in case anyway. That's how entrenched this way of thinking is.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, I have patients with total cholesterols of 300-400. I have a couple total cholesterol 500 that I manage without statins. Now, you and I think statins may be both overprescribed and potentially underprescribed. And I think before we go any further, to my audience, I'm not telling you to go off statins cold turkey. You need to talk to a doctor about this plan. I do prescribe statins. I use them to drop inflammation until I can teach you how to eat. And then it's very rare that I will use a statin once I teach you how to eat, because quite frankly, you probably won't need it. And if I can interject one other thing, many of you need to know about a particle called lipoprotein little a, sometimes called LP little a. It is the worst of all the bad actors, and you inherited an ability to make it or not make it. And here's a scary thing. LP little a is probably the #1 cholesterol particle that causes familial heart disease and early coronary artery disease. Statin drugs actually raise LP little a. And look it up, it's in the literature, and I can't tell you the number of times that I have patients who LP little a is clearly their issue. They've had bypass, they have multiple stents, they're taking monster amounts of statin drugs, and as we wean their statin drugs off and get them on niacin or niacinamide for their LP little a, lo and behold, their LP little a plummets, and just by getting them off statin drug. That doesn't mean tomorrow stop your statin drug, but Jonny, what do you say? Are statins?
I couldn't agree more. First of all, I'm not a medical doctor, and even if I was, I'm not treating my audience over the internet, and I would never anybody ever to just drop a drug without supervision. So I totally agree with you about that. As far as statins, other beneficial effects that you mentioned, the inflammation one, I say this, and Dr. Sinatra says it all the time. Statins do a number of things. In my opinion, the least important is lowering cholesterol. They also lower inflammation somewhat, and they thin the blood a little bit. So they make, as Sinatra likes to say, they turn it from the consistency of ketchup to fine red wine. Okay, those are good things. I happen to personally believe you can do both of those things with zero side effects using fish oil, ginkgo, vitamin A, you name it. So these things are not hard to do without a statin. But for those who don't take anything and they're literally just following their conventional doctor's advice, they give them a statin, there may be some mild anti-inflammatory and blood thinning effects that are good. I would prefer to see those gotten through supplements that don't have a side effect profile like statins. But I agree with you. Dr. Sinatra agrees with you. There are cases in which they might be beneficial. I'd love to mention that underprescribed thing, because I am a perfect example of that. And everyone used to think when we first came out with the book, oh, they just think everybody's overprescribing statins. Well, we do think everybody's overprescribing, but we also know that the reverse comes along. And so I'm a perfect example of that. For years and years, I had perfect cholesterol measured by the old way. My LDL was under 100. My HDL was, it wasn't much above 40, but it was still okay. The ratio was good. Every doctor, oh, you're fine. Nothing wrong whatsoever. And then I discovered the particle test or the NMR test or the lipo panel or any of the ones that we're talking about, Dr. Gundry and I are talking about. And that test showed a very different story. Very, very high particle number, 2,200, high risk, nasty pattern of little b ones and not so many little big fluffy a ones. It was a wake up call, and luckily the cardiologist I chose. Well, I had a few that I bounced this off, and they came up with different things, but certainly one of them was, hey, let us put you on 5 milligrams of Crestor. We'll knock those particles down like that. And I said, I'd like to hold off. Let's see if there's another way. And I went to the cardiologist who is the head of the lipid clinic at Scripps Institute here in San Diego. And he's extraordinary. And I know that he has quite a repertoire of things, not just limited to statins. And I went to him and I said, here's my numbers. What do you think? And he said, well, the first thing is I hope you're eating a high-fat diet, which made me love him even more. But he designed a supplement routine which added to the things I was doing already. We put it on a trial, did it religiously for 6 months. Particles dropped from 2,200 to 16. They're still not great, but they went from high risk to like yellow light, like you should watch this. And the particle size just barely shifted into the good pattern A, where it's mostly fluffy. Guys, a ways to go. It's not overwhelmingly fluffy, but it moved the needle from like pattern B to pattern A. So these things are changeable with supplements, and that would be my preferred way to go. It's not to say that statins can't help. As I said, one of my reference doctors said, I think five milligrams will do it. I know you're not a fan of statins, but that will do it. And it probably would. But what I am not a fan of is people prescribing statins or not prescribing statins based on a test that no longer works.